right. Thank you, Lacey, for being a guest today on the Holistic Hub podcast. I'm so excited to talk to you today about the topic regarding adrenal dysfunction.
Oh, yes, me too. I am such a fan of yours. Low key, like, girl fan. And I'm very excited because honestly, like cortisol issues, adrenal function, thyroid function, really anything functional medicine based, I'm obsessed with. So I'm so stoked to talk about this.
I'm so excited. I love your enthusiasm because I get so nerdy regarding like all topics regarding like adrenal dysfunction, environmental toxicity, everything. So I completely share your enthusiasm.
I love
So,
it.
yay. So, well, I'm such a fan of yours as well. And what really drew me to wanting to interview you is just seeing like the passion that you have regarding talking like cortisol issues, gut supports, environmental toxicity, all these different things. And I really believe that adrenal dysfunction plays such a key part in a lot of these different conditions and scenarios and doesn't get talked about enough or isn't enough of a protocol to be implemented. It's not getting implemented enough in a lot of people's protocols. So I'd first love to just hear like what drew you to this topic in the first place, because this is such an important piece, and what got you started in wanting to really shed light on all these different topics.
Yeah, of course. So essentially, it all started from causing my own health issues. I went from and created my own hypothyroidism through chronic stress and having high cortisol. Essentially, I was doing bodybuilding shows, online training, master's degree, dietetic internship, which if people don't know that, it's basically you're working for free full time while doing a master's degree. And I thought I could just do it all. And unfortunately, I couldn't. And I started developing as a small person, like weight gain, hair loss, digestive issues, dry skin, acne, you name it, like everything, and ultimately became hypothyroid. And I didn't know what was going on. And so I dove deeper because I was getting my master's. We were talking about iodine and I was like, oh, iodine, thyroid, you're a fellow nerd. So I dove into functional medicine books about it. And then as I was reading Aviva Romm's book, I was like, hello, I'm hypothyroid. This is me. So then I found out about the thyroid cortisol connection, and it all made sense to why I was trying all these different thyroid medications, could never heal my body, never felt better, because it wasn't my thyroid. It was the cortisol impacting my thyroid. So that's how I got started into learning about and being obsessed with cortisol, but also being obsessed with functional medicine in general.
Yeah. Oh my God. Thank you so much. And I always say this every episode, but I love hearing people's stories because that passion that you gained from learning through your own experience is now developed into wanting to help other people and learn. So thanks for sharing your story.
Yeah, that's only part of it. I mean, after that, I've dealt with mold, candida, parasites, SIBO, everything. But, wouldn't take it all back because it's made me such a better clinician and practitioner.
Absolutely. Well, so let's dive into the topic today. So regarding adrenal dysfunction, particularly, I actually want to address the controversial term adrenal fatigue. So that's pretty controversial. So let's go ahead and just start with the general question. Is adrenal fatigue a real condition?
So there's a difference between adrenal insufficiency and quote unquote adrenal fatigue. So in reality, our adrenal glands can stop producing cortisol. They can stop working. That's called Addison's disease. So with these clinical diagnoses, we have Addison's, in which our body's no longer making cortisol. We've got Cushing's, in which is hyperproducing cortisol. But most of the time, nobody probably listening to this is going to actually fall into those ranges. So then we have quote unquote adrenal fatigue, which is basically this like fancy term for saying that your adrenals are no longer working as much. The key thing is your adrenals don't actually, unless you have that Addison's disease, they don't stop producing cortisol. They don't become fatigued. They adapt. So it really should be adrenal resistance, adrenal adaptation. Your body has adapted to the short-term into long-term chronic stressors. So it's working. It's just not working as optimally because it's a safety mechanism response.
And how would you differentiate potentially between like adrenal fatigue versus like mitochondrial fatigue and even like thyroid fatigue? Like, are there differentiating symptoms that like might lead you, before doing testing, lead you to thinking like, okay, like one of these is more impacted than the other, or potentially all three of them are impacted simultaneously?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And it's so hard because all these symptoms can go like together. They can look like the same thing. But if I'm differentiating between like thyroid fatigue and adrenal fatigue, for the most part with adrenal fatigue, it's going to be more so like chronic exhaustion, burnout, low libido, low blood sugar, low blood pressure, weight loss or weight gain, anxiety, depression, digestive issues. The key symptom that I find with quote unquote adrenal fatigue, or when you're in that low cortisol phase, is more so immune system has gone kaput, weight gain, and typically that chronic exhaustion. Then with thyroid fatigue or thyroid issues, it's more so generalized fatigue, not like chronic fatigue, but generalized fatigue, hair loss, eyebrow hair loss, digestive distress, anxiety, irregular periods, things like that. And then mitochondrial fatigue is more so 100% energy issues. And then I see a lot of like toxicity-based symptoms. So like increased sensitivity to smells, fragrances, things like that. And they do go hand in hand, because if the thyroid is not functioned, if the thyroid's not functioning correctly, if cortisol is not in a healthy, happy place, your mitochondria aren't working correctly. The mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. So they all kind of go hand in hand, and they're all connected. And I know a lot of people ask like, hey, what comes first? Is it cortisol? Is it thyroid? Is it mitochondria? And it depends on the person, but for the most part, almost everything does start with cortisol, because we have our hypothalamic pituitary axis, so the HPA axis. Anything that's going on with the hypothalamus, the brain, is going to filter down into the pituitary, which signals the body to release ACTH, to then signal the adrenal glands to make cortisol, and all that filters down and then communicates to the thyroid and the ovaries, or the testes in men, and that impacts your thyroid and your sex hormone metabolism. So I really do believe everything does truly start with cortisol.
And I love on your account on Instagram, you talk about the 4 different stages of like that stress response. So maybe we can kind of dive into that. And then alongside that, you already kind of mentioned different symptoms regarding adrenal dysfunction, but since that's kind of the focus of the podcast, maybe we can tie in like the definite like key symptoms that really is leading you to believe that there is that adrenal dysfunction that's at hand.
Yeah, of course. So there are basically 4 different stages of the stress response that I put into my book, The Women's Guide to Hormonal Harmony. I've changed it into making it 3 because it's a little bit more simplified. But if we're talking about the 4 stages of the stress response, stage 1 is the alarmed and alert, or I call that boss bitch mode. So we're just running from the tiger. And typically we don't actually feel that there's an issue. We're just getting crap done. Whether you're a busy mom, a big work schedule, whatever it is, you're alarmed, you're alert, you're ready. So typically there's high cortisol, high DHEA, high neurotransmitters like norepinephrine, epinephrine, which are also adrenal hormones. And then after that, we go to stage 2, which is the wired and tired. This is when we start feeling it. We might have, a little bit of energy issues in the morning, afternoon energy crashes. We might feel like we're wired and tired at night, not able to like calm and sleep. But typically this is when cortisol remains high and the neurotransmitters start to do a little bit of tanking, and DHEA might be high or low. Then after that time frame, it could be months to years, or after a extremely stressful period of your life, like a loss of a loved one, car accident, whatever it is, we go into the stage 3, which is the resistant but not rested type of situation. So this is when we start to see cortisol actually start to tank, and we lose that stress resiliency, we lose our immune system, and we also start to see the neurotransmitters kick back up as a last-ditch effort to try and get rid of whatever stressor's there. And the last phase, which is the chronic exhaustion phase, just plain exhaustion, is when we have low cortisol, low neurotransmitters, and we've lost all stress resiliency. So for the most part, it can take years, it can take months, it can take after a specific event like prednisone to push us into these different phases. And the hard thing is, like, you can have symptoms of high cortisol, feeling wired and tired, but actually have low cortisol. So the key thing is, please test, don't guess, but also understand that saliva cortisol does change on a day-to-day basis. So it's not like this is what your exact cortisol is every single day, but definitely do recommend testing. And it's essential to be able to recognize, okay, are my symptoms cortisol, or could they also be nutrient deficiency related, toxicity related, gut related? It's essential to look at the entire body.
And when you have clients that come to you, is there a stage that you typically see most people at by the time they get to you? Like, are people coming in like at that stage 1, stage 2, or is it typically around like they're hitting that stage 3 or that stage 4 where they've like burnt the bridge at both ends and they're just completely exhausted, like unable to just do normal day-to-day activities without feeling completely overwhelmed?
Yeah, I see most people come to me in the adaptation phase, because that's when you start feeling things. When people are in fight or flight, like I rarely catch it, maybe like 1 to 2 times a year. And I actually weirdly get excited when I do. I'm like, oh, we caught it before it got worse. But yeah, most people are in the adaptation phase, because that's when you start developing the hair, skin, nail issue, the digestive issue, the sex hormone balances, the fatigue. That's when you start feeling it. So that's typically when people come. Praise God, they come to me before low cortisol. Some people come when crap has hit the fan. But
yeah. So then you mentioned some of the different kind of like root causes or things that you see typically lead to it. So let's like dive a little bit deeper into that. So you mentioned there could be some form of like stressor event that happened that then just kind of set everything downhill. But are there other things that could have been like accumulating leading up to that point? What are like, yeah. So what are some of the biggest like root causes, I guess you could say, for seeing somebody coming in with that stressor response?
this is a fantastic question. So with cortisol issues, the body does not know what is a real stressor versus a perceived stressor. And it doesn't know or care if it's a physical, emotional, mental, spiritual stressor. So when people develop cortisol issues, sometimes it could be a chronic pain issue. It could be coming from long-term workaholic, being a busy mom. Other times it can be from like long-term trauma, mental or emotional abuse, imbalanced spiritual health. But I like to say a lot of people, for the most part, they come to me from an inability to deal with that chronic stress, deal with allostatic load, which is basically how your body like handles different stressors and balances them out. And it could be from under eating, over exercising, not balancing your blood sugar, to a toxin bucket overload from environmental toxins, heavy metals, mold, to just the trauma. So I like to say anything that could tell your body, I'm not safe, an internal or external tiger, could potentially cause some cortisol issues. And I know for me, it was at the first part that I did it, over exercising and completely just doing too much. And for other people, it's their environment. Too much mold, too many toxins. Their body can't handle that. That keeps them into fight or flight mode.
Mm-hmm. And that's such an important point that you brought up. I was going to be asking about the role of environmental toxicity in all of this, particularly mold toxicity, because if we aren't catching the fact that somebody might be in that adrenal dysfunction mode where their body is just pure exhausted, how are they going to be able to handle a mold protocol or be able to detox from anything, from mold, from SIBO, from Lyme, anything? Because if we're not supporting our adrenal support, our thyroid, our mitochondria, then the detox is just usually going to be way too overwhelming for the body. And I don't know about you, but that's typically a lot of the clients that I end up getting as well are ones that potentially have gone through some of these really intense protocols, and that just made them worse. Even though the protocols themselves were great, it may have just been missing that key support that they needed the entire time. Is that typically something you see too?
Oh yeah, because if the body is not in a state of homeostasis, and if you don't have regulation of your nervous system, then you're not going to be able to tolerate anything, because anything that you put in, your nervous system thinks it's essentially a tiger and it's going to be running. Or if you have low cortisol, you're going to throw everything in and the immune system is not ready to be there. You've lost all stress resiliency. And if you do anything like, say, you want to do a mold protocol, you're doing some chelation work, some binding work, well, if that hits your body, you don't have anything that you need to suppress that inflammation and help to get rid of that infection.
Yep, absolutely. I'm so glad that we touched on that. So let's kind of go back then to the role between the thyroid and the adrenals. So we've already kind of touched on this, but if you typically see both are suffering and both need support, is there a typical is there an order that you like to go in when supporting either the adrenals or the thyroid? You support like the thyroid first and the adrenals both simultaneously, adrenals first? Like what is typically the presentation and then the support that you'll implement for that?
Definitely trying to support both, but I find that the first thing to work on 100% is cortisol. Now, don't get me wrong. If somebody has maybe normal cortisol levels and they have a low end range thyroid, they can develop a cortisol issue because the stress on the body of the low thyroid can manifest and worsen into a cortisol issue long term. However, for the most part, what I do see is a cortisol dysregulated issue is going to manifest into a thyroid based issue. So I always, with anything that I'm working on, I always want to make sure cortisol is in a healthy and happy place, because say you're dealing with the mold or the gut, you can't heal that until cortisol is in a better place.
Yeah, definitely. And what's the testing that you like to implement when someone's coming to see you, to just kind of, let's just say, okay, they're dealing with a lot of these different cortisol symptoms. So is there testing that you like to implement, or will you start to maybe just give some generalized support before you do testing? Because we want to kind of see where along that hypothalamic pituitary adrenal thyroid axis that we want to be supporting. So yeah, what's kind of the testing that you like to use and different methods for that?
So the best thing anybody can do prior to doing any testing is balance their blood sugar, stay hydrated, consume electrolytes, get proper sleep, cut toxic people out of their life, stop doing everything and think they've got to do everything in the world. Those are the top 6 things that I say you got to do. And if you're doing that, you have an anti-inflammatory diet. That's my dog. He's going to try and say hello. If you're taking care of those things and taking a deep breath during the day, not constantly go, go, go and trying to get things done, that's when, if you still have symptoms, you've taken control of over that. That's when we do the testing. And I typically start with, okay, let's do an entire blood panel. Let's look at your thyroid, sex hormones, CNP, CBC, nutrients. I try and look at everything just because I've seen most people have a lot going on. And then I'll typically do a 4 or 6 point cortisol, 6 point looking at that cortisol awakening response, which we can dive more into. But I'll do that in addition to a GI map if I feel like there is gut involvement. And for the most part, if there is a cortisol issue, I mean, stress in itself, high cortisol, causes our body to lower secretory IgA, and we have or develop leaky gut, which is basically a fancy term for those tight junctions start becoming loose. Then we've got food antigens, particles, everything coming into our bloodstream, causing digestive issues and a worsened reaction. So I typically do all of that together because there's such a downstream effect on the body.
Yeah, definitely. And I would actually love to dive into that test that you were mentioning, the 6 point cortisol test. And what's the company that you like to use? And yeah, what are some of like the presentations that you might most commonly see? And to build off of that question, do you typically see more lower cortisol like in the morning, or what's kind of like the presentation that you typically see alongside many of your clients?
Yeah, so the cortisol awakening response is basically very, very, in the start of the morning. Typically you want cortisol to be highest in the morning, lowest in the evening. So that cortisol awakening response, what happens is we have like a roller coaster. So we have a peak in our cortisol within 30 minutes upon wakening, and then it drops within 60 minutes. That's the cortisol awakening response. So we want an up down, pretty aggressive. And then cortisol starts to tank through the entire rest of the day. And what we see in the general like adaptation phase of cortisol, or if we see it in low like chronic fatigue, PTSD scenario, is people don't have that cortisol awakening response. And that cortisol awakening response is so important for apoptosis, which is the killing of destructed red blood cells. It's basically like the cleaner and sweeper in our bodies and brains to get rid of destructive material, things that increase inflammation in our body, toxins. So I see a lot of times in the adaptation phase, and honestly with a lot of people, especially people that don't get sunlight in the morning, night shift workers, but I see they don't get that cortisol awakening response. And then they're dealing with a lot of chronic fatigue too, but also a lot of pain, exercise intolerance, salt and sugar cravings. The biggest thing I see is chronic pain with that low cortisol awakening response. And I think you mentioned you wanted to address symptoms in regards to high or low. Is that it?
Yeah. So what's like maybe the presentation that you typically see, so a lot of people that are coming to you, you'll typically see more of that low cortisol in the morning. Is that correct?
Yeah, I will sometimes. It just truly depends on the person. So the generalized adaptation response, what I typically see is there's like trends in cortisol, DHEA, and the cortisol awakening response. So when somebody has, say, fight or flight mode, typically it's high cortisol, high DHEA. And then when I start to see the adaptation phase, that's when I actually see, for the most part, cortisol at night will start to be high and you'll be normal in the morning. But once you've surpassed that, that's when I typically see low AM cortisol. And then the afternoon, it might be low or high. Evening might be low or high. That's when you start to seeing the adaptation. When I see low AM cortisol and no cortisol awakening response with low DHEA in particular, that's when I'm like, okay, they're entering in that final phase. We've got to figure out what is going on.
Hmm. When you see cortisol that's really high at night, that typically would present as like a night owl presentation, right? Where they're really wired, they're up all night. I've heard some interesting remarks just throughout the years in terms of, and I'm just curious if this is something that you pick up since you say that you're running these GI panels alongside doing some of these cortisol markers. So, do you ever see parasites alongside somebody having more of like a nighttime owl response with higher cortisol? I'm just curious if you've seen that because that's just something that I've heard about, but I haven't personally seen that presentation in my clients. But I'm just wondering since you work more with people with this condition.
Yeah, I've seen a couple. More so I see people with like the night owl effect. They just don't slow down, and then the nighttime is when their body's able to finally catch up. But yeah, for parasites in particular, they're going to lower our serotonin, which in turn is going to lower our melatonin, and then cortisol is going to be through the roof, and they're going to keep us awake. They're going to have us try and drive to continuously eat. So yeah, definitely parasites can keep you wired, can keep you up at night, can wake you up in the night, for sure.
What about specific nutrient deficiencies? So, are there any particular nutrient deficiencies that you see somebody that's coming in with that low cortisol response in the morning?
Mm-hmm. So cortisol, to make cortisol, our body wants a lot of B vitamins and vitamin C. And then magnesium. There's more to that with electrolytes. So for the most part, if somebody's coming to me with cortisol issues, there is some shape or form of depleted magnesium, zinc, B vitamins, especially B5 and B6. Those are the top two because those are needed to make cortisol. And then I see with electrolytes, it depends on where you are in the phase of adrenal fatigue. So typically, if you are having more so like low cortisol, you have too much potassium and you've decreased sodium. And if you are high cortisol, it's typically you have way too much sodium and you don't have enough potassium. Then there's more to the story. If you developed gut issues secondary to leaky gut from high cortisol, and now you're in low cortisol, typically there's a lot of other nutrient deficiencies that I see, which is a big reason why I do a full entire nutrient panel. But yeah, those are the top ones that I see 100%. I mean, stress depletes your body of magnesium, right? And zinc, and then all these other Bs. So I see a lot of deficiencies, unfortunately. And like I said, you have to have those nutrients to make cortisol and thyroid hormone, right? And to have healthy, happy mitochondria. So if you don't have those building blocks, it keeps you in that state of issues and you can't get fixed until you've replenished those nutrients.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned building blocks. So again, too, and also alongside that blood sugar issues. So making sure that we're having balanced meals, having enough protein, right? Oftentimes we need more protein, more building blocks to be able to support our bodies throughout this whole phase. So is that something you're also implementing and talking with your clients about, is just building like well-balanced meals, making sure there is the optimal amount of fats, protein, carbohydrates, things like that?
Yeah, because big time what you don't want is you don't want a blood sugar roller coaster being up and down. So essentially high insulin and high blood sugar in itself can contribute to a worsened inflammatory response, worsened cortisol response. But also if you're skipping your meals or if you're going hypoglycemic, and maybe that hypoglycemia is because you just ate some candy or some cookies with just carbs and then your blood sugar's dropping. Well, in order for your body to bring your glucose back up, guess what has to do that? Cortisol has to be pumped out so that your liver can then dump glucose so that you actually have fuel. So if you say you have low cortisol, your body doesn't have that, so you're not running on carbs. You definitely have to make sure that you are consistently eating. And then if you're not balancing your blood sugar, that up and down is worsening your cortisol issues. So hands down, like balancing your blood sugar is 100% one of the keys to making sure that you are taking care of yourself and preventing worsening cortisol issues.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love it. What role does cholesterol play in all of this? Do you typically see it really elevated in somebody that's dealing with this adrenal fatigue dysfunction, or have you ever seen super low cholesterol in this scenario? Like, what's kind of the presentation that you typically see?
Yeah, so cholesterol is a backbone for almost all of our sex hormones. And with cholesterol in particular, it also helps with activating our mitochondria. So what I typically see is with cholesterol, if somebody has high cholesterol, there's high cortisol. Low cholesterol, there's low cortisol. It does not always match up, but typically cholesterol is going to be also overproduced if you have hypothyroidism, a lot of inflammation. It's actually kind of like protective against the body, which is a whole nother conversation with cholesterol, cardiovascular disease, you name it. But yeah, that's typically what I see. So I typically am a big fan of saying, okay, please don't stay away from cholesterol, even if it might be elevated. This is telling us that there's a stress response and we need to work on balancing your blood sugar.
Yeah. And, I think a typical presentation that I see, and I'm curious if this is something you see as well, is sort of this resistant weight loss, just kind of bringing this into the picture as well, where somebody might be restricting calories or restricting, proper macronutrient intake for a really long time, and they're still having issues with losing weight. But oftentimes, like you keep mentioning, this stressor response in the body. If the body doesn't feel safe and we have increased cortisol, the body's just going to be holding on to that excess weight. There's all these different presentations that can kind of start to lead us to thinking there might be this dysfunction that's just occurring along that axis that really needs control. And also just nourishing your body. Like I think it all just kind of comes back to there's this depletion of these different vitamins that are occurring. We need to make sure that we're including cholesterol, proper building blocks within our meals. So is that something that you typically see and potentially need to have this conversation with your clients, that it's okay to start to nourish yourself a little bit more, incorporate more foods, incorporate more of a healthy diet, healing diet?
Yeah, 100%. And the key thing is, like, when you are releasing cortisol, it's an anti-inflammatory hormone and it's trying to get you to run from the internal or external tiger. But when it's doing that, it's also basically making you catabolic. So you are losing muscle mass potentially, but also turning your amino acids into sugar. Then you've got higher end range glucose, high fatty acids in your bloodstream. Your body's trying to get you to run away from the tiger. And when that happens, it also decreases the utilization of glucose to your cells, decreases the insulin. And so what you see is this like insulin resistance development. And with that and all the fuel in your body, you start developing insulin resistance into weight gain. And sometimes with that, muscle mass loss. And it becomes really hard for people because they're like, okay, my body changed out of nowhere. I don't know what's happening. And in turn, it's like, I deal with a lot of people. They're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to eat well because I'm gaining weight and I feel inflamed. But it's like, okay, right now, that is the best thing that you could do to nourish your body so that it doesn't feel stressed out to the point where then you're going to continuously have these cortisol issues. So it's nourishment and understanding the whys that 100% is helpful.
Yes, thank you. So you mentioned earlier, alongside some treatment that you'll do for adrenal support. Now you talked about like B vitamins, vitamin C, magnesium, zinc. What about adaptogens and what about glandulars? Where alongside like someone's presentation do you typically implement either of those?
I'm a big fan of all the above. I have specific adaptogens that I love. Glandulars should only be used if you have low end range cortisol and you've tested and you've had it. So that's the first thing that I always like to say. But then adaptogens should be used smartly. So different adaptogens do different things. Some adaptogens are just nourishing, so they don't move cortisol up or down per se. Some of them are energizing. Some of them increase cortisol. Some help linger cortisol in your body longer. They work on the 11 beta HSD enzyme like licorice. Others are sedating or they decrease cortisol. So I use adaptogens based on the person. What are their symptoms? What does their cortisol look like? And then, of course, I question, how can I use adaptogens to also help their thyroid and their sex hormones? For example, maca can be energizing, but it also can support any estrogen issues, low or high. And then I love things like ashwagandha, which can be very helpful for improving thyroid function and nourishing the body, decreasing or just supporting and nourishing the cortisol level. So I like to say use adaptogens smartly. And some people respond better to a mix. Some respond better to using one or two different herbs. So I always like to say, start with one or two, see how you do, but make sure that you're using ones that are going to be good for you. For example, licorice, perfect for low end range cortisol. Probably not too much for high cortisol because it lingers cortisol in the body. So I like to use that, but definitely supplement smartly. And if your listeners have any questions, I mean, my cortisol chapter in my book is on my website for free. You can go in there, look at the adaptogens and see what might work for you.
Awesome. I have a question about two other adaptogens. What do you typically use, either ashwagandha, or do you like to use holy basil or reishi? Either of those particularly with adaptogen support?
I love all of those three. Ashwagandha is my favorite because most people like that in regards to being more calming and helping to decrease stress and anxiety. Holy basil, though it's supposed to lower cortisol, can be more energizing. So I'll use that during the day if somebody's having like higher in range cortisol, but it's not something I like to do if there's like high evening cortisol because there's a potential it might be energizing. And then what was the last one you mentioned? Reishi? Oh, love reishi. It is so good for the immune system, for the gut lining, antiviral. definitely nourishing for cortisol for everybody. I mean, it's funny you asked that because I was sitting in my house yesterday and I take my reishi and I was like, what would happen if I just tripled my reishi consumption?
You're like,
I
might as
did
well
that.
try it out.
I know. I was like, it can't be bad.
I love it too. Both my husband and I take it. We're obsessed. That's probably our favorite
So
one.
calming.
So I know. I'm like literally obsessed with it. So when in somebody's, I love that we touched on glandulars for a little bit, and you said like that typically, like when you do use glandulars, will that be more of a short-term use to start to rebuild up, because it's not long-term use like we're using like our adaptogens and other supports, correct? So because oftentimes I can see presentations where clients have been on it for an extremely long period of time, and we just don't want that. So I'm curious, like kind of what's like the time range? Like I know every client's going to be a little bit different, but in terms of like how long you might end up using that for, just to help bump things up, get things in the right direction, then we can start utilizing some of the other supports you mentioned.
Yeah, I say 3 months is typically what I do. So if I see somebody has low cortisol, we'll do the adaptogens, dive into the root causes, lifestyle, everything, but we'll go 3 months and then we'll wean off of them. The problem is the adaptogens make people feel good and they give them that energy because it's giving what they're deficient in. And they would rather do that versus dive into the other root causes and change their diet and lifestyle and just stay on the supplement. That's the issue. So it's hard. I know if people have asked me, hey, can I stay on this? And I'm like, no, you can't. We have to come off of it. I'm so sorry. But
You'll
it's
thank me for this down the road.
Right. I don't think people understand that taking the glandular is just like taking a thyroid medication. You're giving your body what you're low in. But just like with taking thyroid hormone, we don't want your body to continuously then downregulate and be like, oh, hey, I got enough. So yeah, I like to say 3 months on the glandulars max. Adaptogens is a different story. And I do also like recommending like coming off of adaptogens and cycling them as well. But yeah.
Awesome. And last question, when it comes to treatment interventions in terms of supplemental use, do you typically ever recommend to any of your clients to go for any sort of pharmaceutical version to help with that stressed out response, with the cortisol response?
Like Cortef?
Mm-hmm.
I've actually never had clients do that. I have had some come to me that were taking Cortef and then preferred doing the glandulars, but typically no. But there's some cases, if we're talking prescriptions, if somebody's going through a very high stressful period of their life, for example, they lost a loved one, I mean, there's a chance that you could use like pharmaceutical, and I'm not anti-pharmaceuticals, but you could use like an antidepressant or something like a Zoloft to try and just get you through that period. That might help you decrease your worsened cortisol response. But yeah, I see most people do very, very well with the adaptogens and the glandulars. But I find, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just, I know
we
both get so excited talking about this. No, so I was, I just wanted to say that thank you for saying that, because, in general, with different conditions, there is a case for anything that could get used. But I really believe too, when it comes to like that adrenal cortisol support, you can really get by utilizing a lot of the interventions that you mentioned. And we'll still dive into a couple other questions regarding all this that I have for you. But I just wanted to use that to say, like, this is going to be very empowering for a lot of people listening.
Oh, good. That makes me happy.
Yeah. What were you going to say? Got you so excited.
I was so excited. I was just going to say, like, one of the best things that you could do if you really want to support your cortisol levels would be doing the the parasympathetic work and the somatic therapies, and then diving into your traumas. Hands down. Just something I have to throw out there.
Well, that was seriously going to be my next question, was the role of the nervous system playing in all this, which I love that you mentioned that, because that's huge. I think the role of the nervous system is absolutely so important, and utilizing different therapies for that. And I love that you mentioned somatic based therapy. Absolutely amazing. Are there other supports in the nervous system realm that you recommend for your clients? Like any specific like at home exercises, or even like limbic system retraining? Have you ever had to implement that for any of your clients as well?
Yeah, like DNRS, EMDR, Gupta program, vagus nerve stimulation techniques, love primal trust. Absolutely a big fan of those. Those are when somebody has more of like adaptive, low end range cortisol, PTSD, traumatic things in their life. That's hands down very important, especially when it comes down to mold toxicity. I mean, we've got to retrain the brain because the body's stuck in that fight or flight. Hands down, you got to get them out of it. But I love those. I'm a big fan of doing anything that puts you into that parasympathetic state. So whether that's the more expensive massages, acupuncture, but you could just do grounding in nature, sunlight therapy, dancing, hugging a loved one, pet therapy. Big fan of tapping as well. A lot of people don't think of that, and like the deep belly breathing or like really intense, not meditation, which you could do, but like prayer work. I find that extremely helpful and powerful. Very important to be able to do those things. And then identifying triggers is huge. And I think that's a tool in a lot of people's toolbox that they don't use is those triggers. And those triggers, for the most part, are triggers coming from our childhood. So that allows you to then retrain the nervous system by going back into your traumas, into your triggers, to where that you can prevent those from being things that worsen your adrenal status, and you're able to control those better.
Yeah, it's all about going back to what are your triggers? Where did everything start for you, right? Because like you had mentioned way earlier on in the podcast, sometimes these things can take years to accumulate to the point where we're at now, right? And so oftentimes, like when I get somebody who's presenting with everything, with the mold toxicity, we're having the mast cell activation syndrome, we're having the nervous system dysregulation, the adrenal dysfunction, right? Not always, but oftentimes I'm really just honing in on that nervous system, because we got to start to heal that part of the nervous system that is continuously being affected by whatever trauma, whatever stressors that occurred in that person's life. And so such an important piece. So happy we're talking about it. Yes. So I kind of just want to dive back into the role of environmental toxicity. That's just another piece that I really want to kind of hone in on before we start to end this conversation. So how often do you typically see mold toxins present with somebody that's dealing with that adrenal dysfunction?
Way too often. And almost every single time I've seen somebody with a low cortisol, it has been some shape or form of past or current mold toxicity. And that's because the body will do all these changes to like MSH, vasopressin, all these different downregulation in your cortisol too with that chronic exposure. So with exposures, essentially low-grade exposures, what they do is they create this inflammatory response. So the body is going to want to increase cortisol to help suppress that inflammation. But within the long-term toxicities or an aggressive toxicity like mold, then the body absolutely has that aggressive downregulation, and then we end up with absolutely low cortisol. So huge connection with that. One of the best things that you could do with like cortisol issues and to prevent that definitely is lowering your toxic bucket load for sure.
Yeah. And so let's talk about a typical client presentation where they are presenting with that was potentially their root cause, let's just say, into leading them to that like low cortisol response in the morning, and then just that stressed out adrenal dysfunction. So will you typically start with nervous system regulation, doing some of the ABCs that we talked about, adaptogens, B vitamins, C, things like that, to start to help to regulate that cortisol response, and then start working into detoxification? Or what's kind of the order that you like to work in there?
Yeah, I always like to make sure somebody is nourished first prior to doing any shape or form of detox work, because that and supporting their nervous system. Because one, if they don't have the nutrients that they need to go through detoxification, we've got phase 1 and phase 2 in the liver, we've got methylation, we've got the backup methylation pathway. If they don't have the nutrients that they need, then they're going to feel like they got hit by a truck, and they're also going to probably feel a lot worse. So those are definitely the foundations. And then the nervous system, if you're stuck into fight or flight, or if you're in the dorsal vagal shutdown mode, which is basically like immobilization, I've been there. It's the worst thing in the world. You're not going to be able to fight anything either. Your body is going to be in a constant state of either fight or flight, or absolutely stuck in that basal shutdown. So hands down, like getting the ABCs, balancing your blood sugar, healthy diet, removing and like reducing the bucket effect, electrolytes, water, all that. You have to work on all of that first before doing any crazy work. That's why it kind of scares me that it's like a trend to do these parasite cleanses right now. And it's scary to see people do that, because if you don't have a healthy nervous system, and if you don't have the nutrients that you need to detoxify, those parasite cleanses can make you feel so terrible.
Yeah. And oftentimes the parasite cleanses aren't even indicated, like they're not even necessary. And we might just be wiping out a lot of the good stuff that we end up having in our gut, in our entire body. And then that can just lead to further implications down the road. So I'm so glad that you mentioned that. So yeah. So I love that you talked all about that in terms of the mold toxin piece, and like starting with like nourishment and nervous system regulation. That's a big part of what I do as well, because we got to make sure that the body is well and primed and ready to go. I have one more question for you regarding blood sugar regulation. So you keep bringing this up as a piece that can be really affecting that cortisol response, how they can kind of go hand in hand. So what could be some signs that somebody might be dealing with blood sugar dysregulation, whether it's hypoglycemic or hyperglycemic, and what we can do to maybe start to support that piece alongside like somebody's supports for the adrenal dysfunction that we've been talking about?
That's a great question. So typically what I see is people are required to run on snacks and sugar. So if you feel the need to always have a meal or a snack, especially like 1 to 2 hours after eating, your body's definitely having an issue with regulating your blood sugar. If you have a craving for salt and sugar, if you feel like after your meals, you have this like increased heart rate and heat, you're sweating, that's a big sign. If maybe an hour or two after your meals, you're feeling like you need more food or shakiness, agitation, hangriness, weakness, brain fog, those are signs that you have blood sugar issues. There's also other signs with blood sugar issues. I mean, increased urination is a big one. Weight gain, especially around your abdominal region, is a big one. But I typically see like the hypoglycemic hangriness be a big sign. Plus, of course, with the increased urination and the elevated heart rate after eating food be an issue.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Oh my gosh, Lacey, we covered so much incredible information. This like episode is so chock full of like so many incredible tidbits for people. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast and for the amazing information that you shared. I always love to just leave it with like, is there anything else that you wanted to mention that we didn't cover today, or anything that you wanted to leave with the audience? And then where can people also find you?
I love that. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been such a pleasure. I've listened to all your podcasts and stalk you on Instagram. So that's just me, y'all. But if you want to stalk me, my Instagram is at Faith and Fit. My last piece of advice, honestly, is to make a list and journal down. I'm a big fan of journaling, but journal down what and who are your energy fillers? What and who are your energy drainers? You want the drainers to be as low as possible, and you want the fillers to be high as possible. So I recommend doing that. And then I also recommend, if you can, cutting toxic people out of your life. And that does include friends and family, because those people can be chronic stressors to your life as well. I hate saying that, but it's something that needs to be said.
No, definitely. No, I'm so glad that you talked about that. I don't think that gets talked about enough. So that's really important. So thank you, Lacey, for being a guest on the Holistic Hub podcast. I know everyone's going to love this episode. Yay. So thank you so much.
Yeah, you're so welcome. Thanks again for having me. And for your listeners too, if they want to go into my book, the book chapter on my website, it's upliftednutrition.com, free chapter of the cortisol, and they can find that there.
Amazing. Thank you.
You're welcome.